Welcome, folks, to this week's TCL Blackhawks podcast in conjunction with thechecking.line.com. The Checking Line, awesome hockey discussion since 1875. True story. I'm your host, Matt Cephalou, and with me tonight, as always, are members of the TCL Blackhawks writing team. We have team lead Cheryl Adams.
Hi there.
Team writer Maggie Avila. And team writer Evan Moore. Evan, as this is your first time with us this evening, do you want to go ahead and tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your experience with the Blackhawks?
Okay, well, I've been a Blackhawks fan and a hockey fan in general since about 10 years old, and I also, not only do I write for the Checking Line, I also write for Gabriel's Block, and some of my work can be found at ChicagoNow.com or Chicago Side or Time Out Chicago.
All right. Cool. We look forward to hearing your thoughts and impressions about the Blackhawks in tonight's episode. We have two other TCL Blackhawks writers, Madeline Stroth and Matt Miller, who could not make it this evening, but check them out on thechecking.line.com. You can tweet them, Madeline at Madeline Stroth and Matt Miller at the MJM. And remember to tweet us your questions or comments during our broadcast at TCL Blackhawks. All right, let's get to it. So the Blackhawks played 5 games since our last episode, and they were all wins. They extended the streak since that time. 3-0 win versus St. Louis, 4-3 overtime win against the Columbus Blue Jackets, a 2-1 shutout win versus Detroit, a 5-3 win versus Minnesota, and a 3-2 win versus Colorado. So most of those pretty close games, but ultimately extending the streak to an impressive, I believe they are, 21-0-3 now? Is that right?
That's correct.
All right. So with that, let's talk a little bit about how they did during those games over the last week, sort of a Hawks report card. And Cheryl, do you want to give your impressions of how they've done over the last week or so?
Sure. Overall, Chicago continues to dominate across the board. We have not seen their best games with the exception of Detroit. And, for example, the other night, we saw them take their foot off the gas a little bit versus Minnesota, let them back in the game late. But they did the job, put it away, no problem. So it's kind of amazing that the Blackhawks can win any way you want them to. Come from behind, start with a lead, whatever the case may be. But the Detroit game was really something special.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting, I think, about that one, too, is that it was low scoring, which a lot of people don't tend to think when they think about the Blackhawks, because they have such a deep lineup as far as offensive potential. So an interesting way to get a win for the Hawks, but also ultimately a win's a win. Evan, what about you? Do you want to talk a little bit more about the Detroit win?
Oh, yeah, I could do that. Also, I thought it was their best game of the year, and I thought it was a microcosm of the season of the season as a whole, and they you can see how they improved. Like, they improved so much better than the last season, where last year they had a problem with defense and problem with the power play and such. And I thought it was their best game of the year. It was an exciting game. If I turned away for a second, I felt like I was going to miss something. Or
yeah,
it was one of those games where you had to see your pants and you had to pretty much watch the entire game. And one of the things I liked about the game was a point in the second period, I believe, when they were on the power play. You noticed they changed lines on that play, and then they still were able to apply pressure just as hard as the previous line was. And I think that's something that really sticks out from last year. They were still all over Howard, even though they changed lines. So I thought that was pretty amazing in itself.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think the term that we hear tossed around quite a bit is rolling four lines, which, although a little bit cliche, is pretty accurate as far as what the Blackhawks have been able to do the last few games, especially in the Detroit one, as you mentioned. The pressure that they were able to keep putting on consistently against the Red Wings was very impressive. So, Maggie, let's go to you. Uh, how do you feel about how the Blackhawks have performed in the last week?
I think they've been phenomenal. I think the things they're just doing all the little things correctly. Their defensive play, I think, is really, it's strange. They usually say, the best um, defense is a good offense. I think with them, it's the reverse this year. It's the best, offense is a very good defense. And it seems like even if they get caught out of position, that they cover for one another, or they can get back with their speed.
Yeah,
There's
absolutely.
very few teams can really match them with team speed, which is important, transitioning.
Yeah, good point.
And the other thing I wanted to say about the Detroit game, it just seemed like it was like the whole thing with Patrick Kane just coming into himself. I mean, he just like took over that game at the end, with Stahlberg giving him the dish, but that goal was just really a goal scorer's goal, how he roofed
Hmm.
it over Jimmy Howard, and he's just, I think, found another level.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's something I think I've heard from a couple different sources online. Because we know that Patrick Kane has the passing skills. He's able to move the puck among the best forwards in the NHL. But he's got a really good shot too, and that's something that I think the organization probably wanted to see a little bit more is him take those shots,
Right.
and it looks like he's doing that. So definitely good. Okay, so obviously the Hawks playing really well as they continue the streak. Um, it One of the I think the most surprising results of the last week was the 4-3 overtime win against the Columbus Blue Jackets. Probably not what a lot of people expected, but I think to an extent maybe the Blackhawks underestimated the Blue Jackets a little bit in that game. Agree or disagree?
I think the Blue Jackets are a team that their record perhaps doesn't reflect that the persistence and skill that they have. The problem is that the Blue Jackets don't really have any kind of highlight scorer. They don't have a Patrick Kane or a Claude Giroux or somebody like that who really can kickstart offense. And since Rick Nash left the team, and I think that they're very gritty and persistent, and you see that with they have a lot of one-goal games, and they just can't seem to get it done, unfortunately. And it's a little frustrating to watch them, I think, as a fan, because for them, you see a team that's working really hard and just not getting the wins.
Right.
So they started their game against the Canucks tonight. They took the lead first. The game is currently tied up 1-1 halfway through the third. Who knows? They might get a win tonight. So the Blue Jackets can be very frustrating to other teams. It's like Dallas has been for the past several years. Or what they bring to mind for me currently is the Blues. What the Blues have been prior to Hitchcock coming in as coach again: persistent, hard to play against, physical, giving other teams a difficult time. And we'll see Columbus develop that. We're starting to see some talent come up through
Hmm.
the Columbus pipeline, but they still need to attract some sort of good offensive stars to come out and make a difference there.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, they've got some talent. It's probably a little young yet, so as they mature, that will benefit them quite a bit. All right, moving on to our next topic here, and I'm going to go to you, Evan. recently, I don't know exactly when this was, but Stephen A. Smith, analyst for ESPN, made some comments regarding the Chicago Blackhawks in comparison to the Miami Heat. Is that correct?
That's what he did. It was a segment on ESPN talking about the Blackhawks season and how it compares to it with the Miami Heat's current win streak. And what he said was that he didn't believe it was that impressive because hockey have ties, and he was like, it's not soccer and stuff like that. And I was kind of wondering, if a journalist, he could have did a quick check on his phone, or they could have put something here and tell him that NHL no longer does tie. That the point of a shootout is to have a definite
Right, to break that tie.
Yes, to have a definite winner. So I was just kind of wondering what that was about, and you saw from social media, like right after he said that, how the Hawks fans were pretty angry with him, and they thought he disrespected the sport and thus and that and so. And to me, I was kind of, looking at it like this is, yeah, obviously he's not a hockey fan or a hockey savant like we are or anything like that. So he's gonna pretty much go off of how he perceives it. But I was thinking, like why didn't the moderator, tell him like, hey, they don't.
Right, seems like a relatively simple fix, but and I mean, I don't. The Miami Heat have lost some games this year, correct? It's not like they're.
Yeah, they lost some games, and it's some comparisons there. I mean, they have like the Hawks, they have their core of star players, but I think it's a good thing for the sport where other athletes in other sports are now checking for the Hawks and looking at seeing what they're doing. And you probably know, everyone knows, in the past week and a half the Hawks have led on SportsCenter, and when we ever saw that as hockey fans, like that seen that happen. And it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing for the sport and for everybody involved. And I mean, people get to see the game that we love, and get to see the Indian head on the sweater, and they get to see they know what all the fuss is about.
Yeah, even if an ESPN analyst is misinformed about the scoring format, it is good that the Blackhawks are getting attention, like you said, with cross sports. So that's definitely a good thing. Yeah. Any other thoughts about Stephen Smith?
What I find kind of ironic is that the athletes themselves, I think both Patrick Kane and LeBron James said, they had complimentary things towards each other, each other's team, that, they thought it was good for their sports. So I just thought that was kind of funny.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, that it is good for the sports.
Mm-hmm. So. The other thing, too, is basketball as a league, the NBA, seems, how can I say it? It's not as parity as much as the NHL. There's not as much parity. So that, to me, makes what the Blackhawks are doing more difficult, because their league, all the teams are equal. Whereas in basketball, there's 5 or 6 teams that are kind of dominating. But that's just my spin.
Sure, definitely a difference in terms of the teams being able to sort of take control of their division or conference in the NBA than in the NHL. I can definitely see that. Okay, I think let's wrap that one up and move on to our next topic, if that's cool with you. Let's talk about visors. This is kind of a big thing right now, especially today. I think a lot of different articles and things online have been discussing whether or not, as the discussion regarding player safety continues to be, a hot topic, and this sort of came to light as a result of the puck that Mark Stahl took to his eye in a game against when the New York Rangers played the Philadelphia Flyers. So let's talk about visors. Cheryl, I'm going to start with you. Is this something that the NHL isn't doing enough to really, sort of try and prevent these things from happening? Because right now, I believe visors are not required. Is that right?
Visors are not required, and they are letting players do it on a personal basis, choice basis. Now, you have to look back to the time when the NHL didn't force players to wear helmets either. I mean, somebody
Right.
died on the ice as a result of hockey injuries, and it took them something like 11 or 12 years before they mandated it. It was a necessity to wear a helmet on the ice. And looking back, you're like, I mean, somebody died, and it took them more than a decade to change that as a rule on the ice. I mean, I'm not even sure somebody losing an eyeball would be enough to get the league to
Right.
change it. And it's people come up with the weirdest things to argue against rules, but I can't think of a single legitimate argument against wearing visors. Hockey players would say, well, they get sweaty, blah, blah, blah. There are products you can use to prevent steam buildup. If you're a scuba diver or snorkeler, you're familiar with a lot of these products. So I think that perhaps the manufacturers of these products could recognize that there's a whole other market out there that could be tapped by promoting their products a little bit better. But I don't see any really legitimate reason to argue against visors. And the reason they're giving is they want to have it in the hands of the players, making their own choices. And maybe what that's suggesting is that hockey players feel that they don't have a lot of freedom of choice in a lot of things that come to the league. But when it comes to personal safety, it's such a small thing, and I don't see why any hockey player wouldn't want to wear a visor.
Yeah,
So
definitely agreed. And I think what gets complicated is you have the league, trying to implement these sanctions. You have players who are like, well, I don't really, they want that choice, they want that freedom, like you said. And so, there's two sides of this debate. Obviously, you have, people who are making the argument, oh, well, the league's trying to, if they implement this rule, like, who knows what they're going to implement next. I don't know if that's really a very strong argument. Like you said, I don't know if there's something that's really compelling to kind of contradict whether or not visors should be a necessity. And then you have the other side that's like, well, the league isn't doing enough to protect their players. So it goes along with the whole complication with headshots and that whole ordeal as well. And it's pretty complex, but I agree with you. I don't think there really is a really strong argument for why players shouldn't be required to wear them. Maggie, what do you think? Visors, definitely? No?
I think with athletes, you have to protect them from themselves. I think they don't necessarily, they just want to be out there and they want to play. And whether it's, visors or helmets or whatever, I think they don't always look at things the same way, and they don't view their safety as a priority necessarily. So, yeah, I think there shouldn't be any question that they should have to wear visors. I mean,
Sure.
if it's going to keep them protected, yeah.
Right. And I think, when you say that players might need to be protected from themselves, the mentality for an athlete, as far as I understand it, is you play to win. That's, the ultimate attitude that you have to have. And, if not wearing a visor allows you to be more effective on the ice, which some players would argue, then you would probably not want a sanction that required you to wear a visor. But
right, they may forego their own personal safety, and that's in the long run might not be best.
Right. All right, Evan, what about you? Visors? Yes? No?
Well, it's kind of what everybody's saying. It's you might have to save them for themselves, and you can see what's going on in other sports. Like for instance, this week about they might stop from catchers from blocking the play, and also what you saw with the NFL this past season about knee pads, how they're kind of going to force players to wear them. Some guys have said they're not going to, but that's in terms of hockey. It's something that it probably needs to be done after what happened, but obviously you're going to receive some pushback from some people or rather, or old school about visors, and then you obviously see a lot of defensemen in the league who don't wear visors, and the same thing can happen to them that happened to Stahl the other day. So I guess it's something that they're gonna have to work out in some way somehow, and see what happens.
Absolutely, yeah. That's definitely true. You look at other sports doing very similar things, and I think it's just a matter of time when change has got to happen to protect the players. So, all right, we have a question on Twitter here from a listening member, and they would like us to discuss the NHL realignment. So, Cheryl, I'm going to start with you. How do you feel about the NHL realignment, and how do you think it's going to affect, I guess, hockey fans and the teams in general?
I think there's some interesting choices, let's put it that way, in how they've realigned the league. If you've looked at it, you have basically a cluster of the West Coast teams, then you have the Midwest teams, and then the East Coast is broken up kind of oddly. You have a cluster of what's the current Atlantic Conference, and teams in the area are clustered together. Then Detroit and Columbus get moved up with a bunch of Canadian teams, and I believe it's Boston is the other team, and then they added the 2 Florida teams to that to that division. So basically,
it's a little interesting geographically,
yeah,
but
the Atlantic Division is going to have the travel advantage because basically their teams are clustered so close together you can basically bus from one another to most of them, and you don't have any splits of current major rivalries such as Pittsburgh versus Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
Every other division has got travel, lots of travel. It's not that the Atlantic Division won't have travel too, because they'll be facing off against the East Coast teams, and I believe that part of the realignment plan was for every team to play home and away against every other team, which personally I love that idea.
Yeah.
I love getting to see every other team in the league in the home barn, just because there's so many teams I enjoy watching play that it's nice to see them all come to town. It does destroy some really good rivalries, such as Blackhawks Detroit. But based on Sunday's game, can you imagine the Blackhawks playing Detroit for the Cup? I mean, that would just be a phenomenal final series, don't you think?
Yeah, and I think that's what a lot of people don't realize is that potentially down the road, that's a matchup that people are definitely going to want to see. So despite the fact that now what is the ratio of so how many games would Chicago and Detroit be playing? Only 2? Is that?
They'd probably only be playing 2 during the regular season.
Okay.
That would be the home and the away games. But I don't think the rivalry will completely disappear. There's no teams that have played each other in the history of the NHL as much as Detroit and Blackhawks do, if I recall the statistic. So I don't think that's going to fully go away. But if we looked at Detroit this year, and Detroit is not the same team this year. They're missing Lidstrom. They're missing players who really made a difference on that team. Question mark, will Detroit make the playoffs this year? It's kind of 50-50 at this point, because if they have another bad spell, they could easily fall back out of the playoff contention.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it would necessarily be a bad thing, and not because I don't want Blackhawks to face Detroit, but rather
Right.
because it doesn't hurt to have a recovery year, and after 21 years or 22 seasons, whatever it is, that Detroit has made the playoffs, it's not an embarrassing thing
Right,
to miss
just
the playoffs.
unreal.
Yeah, I mean, they've had an unreal record. It's not going to be touched for quite some time. I do think there are a few rivalries that, yes, we're going to miss seeing, but that'll make the games where they do see each other more special. And I think that for certain teams, most notably Columbus, that this realignment is really going to make a difference for them. I think the Florida teams are going to see more games that are, if not necessarily sold out, then definitely fuller. You have a lot of snowbirds that go down there, so it's a nice inexpensive trip, especially when you compare to ticket prices in Canada, which are insane. And I think for Columbus that they'll be facing off much more frequently against the East Coast teams, of course. So they're going to get a lot of traveling fans that come into their building from, Pittsburgh and Detroit and Washington and so forth, and that's going to help their market a great deal. It's not going to improve the team any if they don't get some good players in there.
Yeah.
But it'll definitely help their team in the whole picture. Western teams, I think the impact we're going to see is that, for example, Vancouver is no longer going to be in a division that's full of, other teams that aren't doing much. So we'll hopefully we'll see more competition over there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But overall, despite some of the things that are like, it's it's a good thing overall.
Yeah, I definitely would agree. I know a lot of fans are the biggest question that I've seen. Or not question, but gripe that I've seen from other people online and on Twitter is that well, what about this this great in-season series that we get with between Chicago and Detroit? It's going to be a bummer to miss that, but it's not like they're not going to play each other again. So I think, like you said, in the long run, it's going to be good. Maggie, how do you think this is going to affect? I guess the fan base, and do you agree with Cheryl that it's going to kind of boost, I guess, participation with fans in other markets?
I do agree with Cheryl. I think the big winner is going to be Florida.
Yeah.
I think they're trying to get people in those stadiums by having Boston, and I think that's the division that has 4 original 6 teams.
Oh, really?
I think it has Boston, Toronto, Montreal, I believe, are all in that division.
Okay.
And yeah.
So yeah, that makes for some good rivalries.
Yeah, and I think it's like she said, that with the Snowbirds down there, you probably have a lot of, I've forgotten Detroit. So you probably have a lot of people from Detroit and Boston who have gone down there, migrated down there. And, it'll help the attendance, hopefully, down in the Florida stadiums. For the Blackhawks, the only thing I'm a little concerned is the teams that are in our group are a little, I don't want to say boring, but yeah, they're a little boring. They're a little boring. Well, the only thing I could say is the Colorado Avalanche. I'm hoping that a real good rivalry comes out of that, since they're a young, fast team as well. And it's nice to have Winnipeg, because Winnipeg, that was crazy that they were going down to Florida. I mean, that was just ridiculous. They had to get them out of there.
Well, and they've certainly had a resurgence, since coming back to Winnipeg. It's been really, incredible to see.
Oh, there it is. Cool. There's the map.
Yeah.
There we go. We got a map of. You can see what the alignment looks like more graphically.
Very cool. Yeah, thanks for pulling that up. So yeah, I agree with you. I think Florida does get quite a big benefit from this. Evan, what about you? Do you think this helps sort of, I guess, the fan bases from other teams, and as well as the game as a whole in the league?
Yeah, they've got, the NHL's got to do something to stop all these labor stoppages, and they're kind of behind the other leagues and in certain things, and I was kind of, when I saw the alignment thing at first, I was like, oh, we're not going to get to see Detroit as much, and then I started to think about it and saw why they did what they did, and saw why certain teams moved and why certain teams stayed as to be done. The teams in the southern states, they need help. They have problems with attendance. That's why Atlanta couldn't hold on to 2 hockey teams. So he had it. How that went there, and it'll be good to see, Winnipeg and see their young players, like Evander Kane, and they still have Dustin Byfuglien and Andrew Ladd, and and that's good to see. It'll be good to see, and create some new rivalries, and you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Now, Chicago and the Jets, I think that's going to be a pretty exciting rivalry because there are the ex-Blackhawks players that are up on that team, Ladd, Bufflin, and so forth. And now, due to proximity, we're going to see them a lot more, and I think that's going to be an interesting rivalry. Also, the Wild used to be a great rivalry back when they were the North Stars.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be interesting to see if that develops as a new rivalry. I'm not looking forward to seeing Dallas more often this in the seasons to come, but I do think that the potential of new/revived rivalries is pretty interesting.
Absolutely. All right, crew. Well, thank you all for joining us. That about wraps up our time. But before we go, Blackhawks have 2 upcoming games the next week before we have our next podcast. They will be visiting the Colorado Avalanche for a bit of a rematch on Friday, tomorrow night. And then they will host Edmonton on Sunday, March 10th. And I believe both of those games will be on Comcast Sportsnet Chicago. So definitely tune in for those. They should be good matchups. Thanks again for joining us. I'm Matt Cefalu. Joining me is Evan Moore, Cheryl Adams, and Maggie Avila. And we will catch you all at our next podcast episode. Check us out, thechecking.line.com. And until next time, good night.